May 8, 1945. The war in Europe had ended only hours earlier. In a makeshift prisoner processing center near Regensburg, Bavaria, sunlight pierced through shattered factory windows, illuminating dust and silence. The air smelled of disinfectant, damp concrete, and fear. About 200 women sat on wooden benches, their Wehrmacht uniforms marked with the insignia of the Nachrichtenhelferinnen, the Women's Army Signal Auxiliary. They sat with rigid backs, eyes fixed forward, hands folded with mechanical precision. Not one spoke. Not one moved. They waited for what they believed was coming. They were not the heroic shield maidens of propaganda, but clerks, radio operators, switchboard technicians, most barely past 20. For years, they had served the Nazi war machine efficiently, transmitting orders that sent men to their deaths. Now they sat in defeat, bracing for vengeance. The door opened. An American officer entered, a captain of the Women's Army Corps, followed by 2 male officers and an interpreter. The women stiffened further. Indoctrination had prepared them for humiliation, perhaps worse. But what followed defied everything they had been taught. To understand the tears that would soon fall in that ruined hall, one must understand what these women had been taught to believe about themselves and their enemies. From childhood, under the Nazi state, women were raised with one purpose: to serve. Kinder, Küche, Kirche, children, kitchen, church were their sacred duties. The National Socialist Women's League and the Bund Deutscher Mädel had instilled obedience and subordination. They were told that men led, women followed, that independence was disorder, and submission was virtue. Propaganda taught them that beyond Germany's borders lived corruption. Soviet women were brutes, British women decadent, and American women soulless slaves to greed. They had been warned. Capture meant violation and death. As the Reich collapsed, Goebbels broadcast that Allied soldiers would show no mercy. They had seen what the Red Army did in the East and expected nothing better from the West. So they waited, still as statues, for brutality. Captain Sarah Morrison of the WAC stepped to the front. A 32-year-old former teacher from Ohio, she had seen the horrors of Dachau and the ruins of war. She knew the women before her had served the Reich, but she was not there for revenge. Through the interpreter, she spoke calmly. They would be processed, photographed, questioned, examined, and housed. Then she added words that stunned the room. You will be treated according to the Geneva Convention. You will not be harmed. You will be addressed by your rank and treated as military personnel. A young corporal flinched and half raised her hand before lowering it in fear. Morrison noticed. Yes? She asked. The interpreter repeated the question. The girl stared in disbelief. You are asking me to speak? Of course, Morrison said. If you have questions, ask them. The girl began to cry. Not quiet tears, but uncontrollable sobs that spread through the room. Dozens of women broke down. The American officers stood bewildered. Morrison knelt beside the weeping corporal, an act unthinkable in Nazi hierarchy. Are you hurt? She asked gently. You spoke to me, the girl whispered. Like I was a person? Morrison said. Yes, you are. To the Americans, this was ordinary decency. To the Germans, it shattered a lifetime of conditioning. They had been trained to endure cruelty, but not kindness. Across occupied Germany that spring, Allied officers recorded the same reaction. Captured German women, trembling with terror, collapsing in tears when treated with respect. Reports noted their shock at humane behavior, their disbelief when officers addressed them as equals under military law. Major Elizabeth Robertson wrote, Many expected to be shot or assaulted. When treated according to standard procedure, they respond with disproportionate emotion, as if dignity itself were inconceivable. The clash of ideologies was profound. The Nazi system had built an entire gender order on obedience and hierarchy. The Führerprinzip, the leadership principle, demanded total submission. Women existed to serve the Volk, their worth measured by loyalty and silence. The Bund Deutscher Mädel Manual taught, the German girl serves through obedience. To submit one's will to authority is the essence of honor. In auxiliary service, that obedience became policy. Women were identified by rank, never name. They did not question orders or contribute ideas. Thought was irrelevant. Execution was everything. In contrast, American military culture, even with its flaws, assumed participation and personal responsibility. The Women's Army Corps trained its officers to lead, think, and decide. They learned logistics, cryptography, communications, and leadership. American women were expected to act, not merely obey. When Morrison asked a German prisoner a question, she was doing what her training demanded, treating people as competent beings. For women raised under fascism, that question struck with revolutionary force. The symbol of that shift was not a flag, but a clipboard. American officers carried clipboards filled with forms: name, rank, unit, service history. After recording, they asked, "Is this correct? Do you want to add or clarify anything?" In Nazi Germany, no subordinate was ever asked to confirm her own record. Information flowed only downward. The clipboard became a quiet emblem of democracy, of power shared, not imposed. Over the following weeks, this new order took root in small, human ways. The women were housed in clean barracks, fed adequately, allowed to write home, even organize within camp limits. They were permitted to speak freely, to decide minor details of daily life. To them, this autonomy was astonishing. Greta Hohenberg, a captured communications operator, later recalled, "We elected a spokeswoman in our barracks. At first, by rank, as always. But the American officer told us election meant choice. Weeks later, we held another vote and chose a younger corporal, simply because she was fair. That was the first vote of my life. We had chosen, and our superior accepted it. Not all accepted the change. Some remained loyal to Nazism, bitter and unrepentant. Yet even they could not deny the unsettling evidence before them. The Americans enforced discipline without cruelty, structure without humiliation. They demonstrated, through routine interactions, that authority need not erase humanity. This was the real denazification, not propaganda or forced re-education, but the living example of a different moral order. The American officers were not saints. They carried prejudices and anger, but their institutions embodied an idea that Nazi Germany had destroyed, that individuals possess intrinsic worth. Hildegard Kalbach, a former Wehrmacht operator who later emigrated to the U.S., Hemiti Toitraun, described it. When the American woman officer asked what I thought about our equipment, I was speechless. I had never been asked what I thought. When I realized she was serious, something broke inside me. It was the first time in my life someone in authority treated my mind as my own. Even eye contact became revolutionary. In the Wehrmacht, a subordinate never met a superior's gaze. It was defiance. Women, doubly subordinate, looked down. But American officers met eyes as equals. "Look at me," they said, not as a command, but an invitation to understanding. At first, the Germans couldn't. Gradually, some learned. They raised their eyes, met the gaze, and found recognition there. "I see you. You exist." That recognition, the restoration of personhood, was the quiet beginning of freedom. It could not erase guilt or undo crimes, but it opened a path toward moral recovery. In time, those moments echoed far beyond the camps. As West Germany rebuilt, many of these women entered civilian life carrying memories of that shock of equality. Some clung to old beliefs, but others, especially the younger ones, transformed. They became teachers, professionals, even politicians in the new democratic republic. They raised daughters who would never bow their heads to authority in the same way. Margarete Fischer, once a senior signals officer, later served in the Bundestag. In a 1979 speech, she said, "People ask when I stopped being a Nazi. I cannot say, but I know when I began to doubt." In May 1945, an American officer looked at me and asked me a question, as if my answer mattered. I had helped kill her countrymen, and she still treated me as human. That moment planted the seed of everything I later came to believe about freedom. To the American officers, the tears of these women seemed a mystery. Reports spoke of psychological fragility, of possible trauma. Few realized they were witnessing the collapse of a totalitarian worldview, the moment when obedience gave way to the possibility of selfhood. The tears were not weakness, they were awakening. Captain Morrison's final report that November read, "We processed over 3,000 women. Most were young, technically skilled but politically unsophisticated. They had been told we were monsters. We treated them by regulation and decency, nothing more. Yet to them it was extraordinary. For many, it was the first time they were addressed as individuals." I have come to believe that this may be the most effective form of denazification. Not lectures, but example, that authority does not require cruelty, that dignity can coexist with discipline. Her belief was prophetic. The new German Constitution, adopted in 1949, began with words that could have been written in response to those encounters. Human dignity shall be inviolable. Equality of men and women followed in Article 3. These were not abstract principles. They were the moral antithesis of the Reich, drawn from lessons learned in its ruins. The women who had once wept in that Regensburg factory carried forward the memory of being seen. Some never spoke of it. Others passed it quietly to their children. That respect is not weakness. That one's voice matters. They had served a regime that glorified domination and died believing they would be punished for it. Instead, they were met with the radical normalcy of fairness, and it transformed them. They were not innocent. They had enabled evil. Yet redemption began with that smallest gesture, a question asked as if the answer mattered. In that moment, they were forced to see themselves not as cogs or victims, but as human beings, flawed, culpable, yet capable of change. The lesson endures. The war was won by weapons, but the peace was built through restraint. The Americans did not conquer merely with power, but with the principle that dignity belongs to everyone, even the defeated, even the guilty. Fascism's foundation was hierarchy and fear. Democracy's was recognition and respect. The clipboard, the handshake, the eye contact, all ordinary things, became instruments of moral reconstruction. Those tears in 1945 were the first sound of that reconstruction beginning. They were the sound of chains breaking, of selfhood reawakening. They marked the death of an old order and the birth of a fragile new one, an order built on the belief that no ideology, however monstrous, can erase the simple truth of shared humanity. And that is why the story endures. In the ruins of war, amid grief and guilt, a few words spoken across a language barrier. "You are a person. Your voice matters," became the quiet spark from which a civilization began to rebuild itself. The women wept, and in their tears something cruel died, and something human began to live.